Throughout the centuries and history, executions have been performed in public to have a strong deterrent effect. Kings and queens did not want people committing crimes, so they made an example of people, and this happened even during the Second World War and afterwards. In some countries, such as the Soviet Union, the authorities wanted to put a number of German war criminals to the sword, and they had many of their enemies executed on the same gallows. This was done to show the Soviet people that those who had previously occupied the lands and had committed huge atrocities were being punished, and for Stalin this was a propaganda boost. The Germans also carried out public executions during the war, especially upon those who were suspected of being a resistor, and even a number of young women were subjected to this, some even being hanged from trees. But at the end of the conflict, there was also a number of female concentration camp guards publicly executed in front of a crowd of 20,000. In this documentary, we look at 5 sets of public executions carried out during and after World War II. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Operation Barbarossa was launched by the German army on the 22nd of June 1941, and it was the largest land offensive in history, with 10 million soldiers taking part. No one would have anticipated that Hitler would launch an invasion on the Soviet Union to begin with, as he actually signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and the pair had agreed not to fight each other for allegedly a decade. But this was then broken, as Hitler's whole belief was to rampage to the east, and he wanted to destroy communism. But during the course of Operation Barbarossa, 3.8 million Axis soldiers entered the Western Soviet Union along a front of around 3,000 kilometres, and they were supported by 600,000 vehicles and more than 600,000 horses. This opened up the Eastern Front, which became the bloodiest theatre of the Second World War, and saw some of the biggest battles in history. But the crimes that the Nazis and the Germans committed inside of the Soviet Union were endless. For example, the Nazis would starve to death and deliberately kill over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and millions of civilians died from starvation and mass food shortages. But following the German army was a paramilitary death squad known as the Einsatzgruppen. These were soldiers who were there to round up civilians and execute them. The Einsatzgruppen's crimes were horrific, and they would force many to dig their own graves before they were then shot in these pits, and still many of their crimes have not been uncovered, and their victims still lie under the ground. Further horror occurred as the German army would abuse civilians, and they would burn and raze settlements to the ground, as well as loot whenever they could. Hitler had specifically given orders for commissars to be shot immediately without trial, and mass killings occurred every single day. The citizens of Leningrad were subjected to a hard and rough ordeal during the Second World War, as they would experience a siege that lasted 872 days, and with this over 1 million people would starve to death. Around 400,000 of these victims were children younger than 14, and the German and Finnish blockade of the city cut off food supplies, fuel, and materials and rations sunk to a very low amount. There was hardly any food to go around, and the Soviet civilians were forced to eat pets, and others resulted allegedly to cannibalism. There were 2,000 people arrested for eating human flesh during the siege. There was a huge amount of suffering, and Leningrad became the site of the most lethal siege in the whole of history. The city had also suffered from German bombardment from the skies, as bombers would rain down on the city, and thousands would be killed by the German bombs. Artillery bombardment also hit the city, and the city was in complete ruins. The siege was eventually lifted, but Leningrad was scarred with the horror of what had happened. The sentiment of those who witnessed what had happened inside of Leningrad led to the belief that those Germans were completely evil, and after the war there was a significant amount of reprisal wanted against those enemies of the Soviets. But at the end of the war, Leningrad became the site where 8 German soldiers who had committed crimes inside of the Soviet Union were executed in the square. 11 Germans were tried in this trial, which occurred inside of Leningrad, and most of them had committed crimes in the Pskov region. It's not known specifically why the Germans were collected in this group, and why they were then taken to Leningrad for their trial. It may have been a propaganda effort because of the horror that occurred in the city during the war. 8 of these men were then sentenced to death. The most senior of those condemned was Major General Heinrich Remlinger, who would during the war order 14 expeditions of German soldiers who would rampage in the Pskov region and would burn villages down. He was linked to the slaughter of 8,000 people, mostly women and children, and documents discovered linked him to this as well, as witness testimony did. His soldiers shot over 200 people in Karamyshevo, and 200 more were burned alive in wooden buildings in Utogosh. The horrors of Remlinger's troops were many more. Another condemned man was Captain Stutthof Karl, who shot 25 people in the Stutthof region. He ordered his men to shoot children and young boys with machine guns, and he was known for shooting 200 people with his own weapons himself. Oberfeldwebel Engel Fritz was part of the platoon that would burn 7 villages, and these men shot 80 people and burned 100 houses and sheds, and the horrors of Fritz's actions were told to the courtroom. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Böhm was found guilty of burning villages down, such as Krivets, Olkhova, and others, in which around 60 were shot dead, and Böhm shot 6 people himself. Lieutenant Eduard Sonnenfeld went on the rampage from December 1943 to February 1944, and he burned villages with his men. In Zapolia, his men killed 40, and in another village named Zeglitsky, Sonnenfeld's men ordered civilians to dig trenches. They then forced them in, as his men threw grenades into the trenches. Sonnenfeld took part in executions, and the court reached a conclusion that he himself had killed around 200 Soviet civilians with his own hand and weapon. Yanika Gergard was a soldier and was not of any particular rank. Was in the village of Malyaluzi. 88 civilians, mostly women, were driven into a barn and were then burned, and Gergard was linked to personally slaughtering over 300 people. Soldier Erwin Ernst was also involved in burning villages, and he killed 100, mostly women and children. The final man who was condemned for his crimes, also known as Erwin, was involved in the executions of 150 people, and in Luga he burned 50 homes, and was then involved in burning other villages and around 200 houses. Those German soldiers and officers were seen by the Soviets after the Second World War as the ultimate evil, especially following the experiences of those who had lived through the Leningrad siege. Their trial was covered by the Leningrad press, and newspapers each day documented what happened. But as mentioned, those men were sentenced to death, and a gallows had been created in Leningrad, on the square, near to a market. The crowds on the 5th of January 1946 gathered near to the gallows for the executions of the German soldiers, and to those who would witness the executions, it was in a sense justified. They had seen how the Germans treated the Soviet civilians firsthand, and they knew the horrors that had occurred. These were people who had been shot at constantly by artillery fire and had been bombed by aircraft of the Luftwaffe, but they were there to see reprisal and revenge. The crowd was large, and the Germans were brought out. Each of them were paraded in front of the crowd, and they did remain calm in their final moments. But General Heinrich Remlinger was not as calm, and he looked for a way out, but there was not one, and he went to his execution not as calm as the others. If he would have broke from the executioners, and it's possible, he would have been torn to pieces by the Leningrad population. There was no sympathy for these men, and the executioner and the officials then announced the crimes of each of them. What struck some was that these were men who had slaughtered many. Many of those slaughtered were women and children. The Germans had been loaded onto the backs of vehicles and lorries, which were then reversed under the gallows inside of the square. Each one had the noose tied around their necks, and when all of the men had been secured to the gallows, the vehicles then slowly drove off. This led to the Germans now swinging from the gallows in the air, and they were left hanging until they were then killed. After the crowds left, the Soviet Guard was there to protect the remains, and some boys threw ice at the executed bodies, but the Guard did nothing to prevent this. The witnesses did not cheer, but there was in a sense justification and revenge for the German soldiers who were executed that day. The city of Leningrad suffered heavily during the Second World War, and the civilians in the city who died during the siege numbered around 1.5 million, but there was a huge death toll also for the Red Army and the German forces. It was one of the bloodiest events of the Second World War, and the levels that the people of the city had to sink to during the siege to survive led to many believing that after the end of the war, that executions against German soldiers and officers were completely justified. These men who were executed were not involved in the siege, they were not involved in the attacks on the city, but they were involved in attacks against Soviet civilians and villages in regions hundreds of miles away. To those civilians of Leningrad, all of these men were evil, and and there is no doubt that their actions were horrific, and that their actions led to the slaughter of innocent people. But the deaths of those Germans on the scaffold in the centre of Leningrad was seen by some as a small reprisal for the horrors that they had personally experienced. Stutthof Concentration Camp was the first camp set up outside of the borders of Germany during World War II, and it began its operations on the 2nd of September 1939. It was a camp linked to the ethnic cleansing of Poland that included executing the elite of Polish society, including politicians, religious leaders, and intellectuals in the area of West Prussia and around Danzig. Lists had been drawn up even prior to the invasion of Poland for people to be arrested, and the Nazis had plans to open up camps following the invasion for these prisoners. It was originally a camp in which civilians would be kept. However, after a huge expansion effort took place, it became similar to Dachau and a labour education camp, in which prisoners would be forced to conduct gruelling work. The first prisoners, around 150 of them, arrived when it first opened, and these were Poles and Jews who were arrested straight after the war broke out. Within a few weeks, the number of prisoners grew greatly to around 6,000, and initially all of the prisoners were Polish. The number of inmates grew as the war went on, with large amounts of Jews being deported to the camp, and many arrived from Auschwitz and other camps across Nazi-occupied lands. Throughout its years in operation, it saw 110,000 people pass through the gates, from all different countries. Amongst the prisoners were Jews from all over Europe, but also resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners of war, communists, psychiatric patients, and many more. The main camp in Stutthof also had around 40 different subcamps that served it during the conflict, with different prisoners based in different subcamps, producing things for different companies. Some of these companies were involved in the war effort, using slave labour to make parts for the German war machine. For example, an armaments factory was based at the camp, but also in the war, a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory was also built there. Conditions at Stutthof were very brutal and extremely tough. Inside, disease was rife and thousands of prisoners died from starvation. A couple of large typhus epidemics killed thousands of prisoners in 1942 and 1944, and this led to selections taking place. During these selections, the SS officers and doctors would select prisoners who were too ill or too weak to continue working to be sent to a small gas chamber that was based on the site. Executions also occurred there, and many Polish resistance fighters who found themselves imprisoned were shot dead. As mentioned, there was a small gas chamber on the site, and using Zyklon B to mass murder prisoners began in June 1944. It has been estimated that around 4,000 prisoners, mostly Jewish women and children, were murdered inside of the gas chambers before the camp was evacuated. Now, the guards at the camp were incredibly sadistic, and there are examples of them inflicting barbaric punishment onto the inmates. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was a guard who was, despite just being 24 when she was executed, she was noted for her horrific treatment. She was one who selected prisoners to go to the gas chambers and also regularly beat women prisoners to their deaths. Bachmann was just one of many guards who was noted for their barbaric treatment, with many prisoners being clubbed and beaten to death. It was estimated that overall around 65,000 prisoners died at Stutthof, with many also drowning in the boggy mud that was inside of the camp. The doctors also killed many injured and sick prisoners inside of the infirmary using lethal injections. There was even allegations made that the SS used human fat from corpses to make soap, and that hundreds of prisoners were executed for this purpose, to just make soap. So Stutthof had an extremely high death count. Executions were prominent, and the guards were noted for their horrific treatment. Suffering continued as in late January 1945, a full-scale evacuation of the camp was ordered. 50,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, were forced out of the camp. 5,000 of them were forced to march to the Baltic coast, and when they arrived there they were forced to walk into the water, and then guards shot them indiscriminately with their machine guns. Other prisoners marched towards eastern Germany, but after being cut off by the Soviets they were forced to return. The horrific treatment during the death march by the SS guards, as well as being provided with little or no food and being forced to walk in the freezing winter conditions, meant thousands died on the death march. The remaining prisoners a few months later were taken from the camp by sea, and more prisoners were thrown into the sea and shot. It's thought that in the evacuation of Stutthof, 25,000 prisoners died. It was eventually liberated on the 9th of March 1945, but only around 100 prisoners were found there, those who had hid from the death march. Following the Second World War, many war crimes trials took place, including the Nuremberg trials, which aimed to bring the leaders of the Nazi Reich to justice. But many less high-profile trials took place to punish those guards inside of the concentration camps, and some of these were known as the Stutthof trials. These were a series of trials to prosecute the guards and officials responsible for the crimes that occurred at Stutthof. There were 4 trials in the series that began in 1946 and ended the following year. One issue was that despite around 2,000 SS staff working at Stutthof, only 72 SS officers and 6 female overseers were ever brought to trial. The trials were held in Gdansk, and during the first trial the 6 women who were accused of being Auschwitz at the camp were placed on trial. These were Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Eva Paredes, Gerda Steinhott and Erdner Beilhardt. During the trial, witness statements and much evidence was heard inside of the courtroom, and it was noted that the women in particular did not seem to take the trial very seriously. In particular, Jenny Bachmann was noted to have been more bothered with her hair, and that she smirked during the presentation of horrific evidence, and even flirted with the guards inside of the courtroom. Of the women on trial, Jenny Bachmann, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Eva Paredes, and Gerda Steinhoff were sentenced to death, with Erdner Beilhardt sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Along with the women, a number of men were sentenced to death, all to be executed together on the 4th of July 1946. On that date, all of those who were condemned were brought to the city of Gdansk, and in particular the Biskupia Gorka, on a large hill that stands in that area of the city. They had been taken to the hill by car, being guarded by Soviet officials. At the site there was a huge crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings. Around 200,000 people lined the area near to the gallows. The gallows in particular here were very large, and it was possible to execute 2 of the condemned on one gallows, and even 3 on the central gallows, such was the size of them. They were also very tall, ensuring that the crowd in attendance saw the bloody proceedings easily. Beginning with Jenny Bachmann, the women and the men executed that day were all loaded onto trucks, and then these were backed up to the gallows. Bachmann was the first to be executed that day, and she wore a simple dress and at 5 p.m. stood under the gallows. Whilst on the truck, her arms and ankles were tied together, and a noose was passed over the wooden structure. The hangman then placed a noose around her neck, and final preparations were made. She was stood facing the huge crowds, and then suddenly the truck drove away, leaving Jenny Bachmann suspended in the air, with nothing to stand on, hanging in front of the huge crowd. She was there dangling, and her hands and feet twitched, and she lost a shoe as she struggled for breath before turning limp and dying. She was the first of 11 executed that day upon the hill in this manner, and the women who were condemned were all executed first. The 5 women were then left hanging, whilst the men were executed, also on the gallows next to them. The public spectacle was absolutely huge, with 11 bodies dangling from the huge gallows. For many who were stood on the hill during the executions, some small part of revenge was had for the horrors that were inflicted at Stutthof Concentration Camp. Overall, a huge amount of people suffered and died inside the confines of the camp, and all of the guards who were executed were killed for their barbaric treatment of prisoners. The women who were executed had different roles inside of the camp, but they all had one thing in common. They were happy to inflict the mass suffering, and happy to murder prisoners with their own hands, or even select them to go to their deaths inside of the gas chambers. Following the liberation of France, there were huge scores of executions carried out upon those people who had helped the German armed forces in any way during the invasion of the nation or during the occupation. It wasn't just soldiers and men who had fought who were considered collaborators, but women who slept with them were, as mentioned, publicly humiliated, and there were also many people who engaged in the black market who were also looked down upon, seen as profiteering from the war. The Provisional Government of the French Republic, which was established and set up, quickly brought order and many collaborators to courts. Some of the most high-profile charged with treason include Philippe Pétain, the former head of the Vichy France, and Pierre Laval, the former Prime Minister of France, who would later be executed. One group who were targeted especially for execution during the fighting of the Second World War by the French resistance were the Milice. This was a political paramilitary group created by the Vichy French regime, along with the Germans to fight the French resistance. They were French people fighting against those forces attempting to liberate them, and the former head of the group was Pierre Laval, with the chief of operations and their de facto leader being Joseph Darnand. The Milice included members of the French far-right parties, and some had actually joined as their families had been killed in Allied bombing raids, or they'd been attacked by members of the French resistance earlier. There were incentives for men to join the Milice, including regular pay, better food rations and employment, and it's believed that by 1944 there were around 30,000 militia men fighting for them. They were identifiable by their distinct blue uniform and also their blue beret. The Milice would carry out summary executions and assassinations of French resistance members, and they were also involved in rounding up those people who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and these men, women and children were then sent on to concentration camps. They were extreme in their actions, and also used brutal torture to extract information from subjects about resistance plans and activities, and they were also seen in the eyes of the resistance as a more dangerous enemy than even the Gestapo or the SS, because of the deep local knowledge of the people they had and the areas they were operating within. But as France was liberated following the D-Day landings, and in the weeks after this, the French resistance put many people to the sword, especially those in the Milice. On the 2nd of September 1944, a series of public executions were carried out against members of the Milice who had been captured by the French resistance. This took place in Grenoble, at the foot of the French Alps, and soldiers of the resistance organisation, the Maquis, had gathered together to execute 6 members of the Milice, men who had worked specifically for the local police department of the Vichy government. The executions were wholly public, and they took place in front of a brick factory, in the very same place where 23 members of the resistance had previously been executed by the Germans. This place was symbolically chosen for the execution. The crowds began to gather at the execution site, and it was said by a witness that they were like rushing to watch a circus, laughing and greeting loudly, and rushing to surround the execution site. At the site, people pushed past each other to find a good view. There was a significant degree of anger inside of France, and after living for years under Nazi occupation, many wanted to see reprisals for the crimes of the Germans, and especially those French people who had betrayed them. The 6 men were all brought out to the execution posts outside of the factory, and they were then secured to the stake after having their arms and legs secured to the wooden post so they could not move. It was said of the executions that the 6 dying men walked straight to the execution post without any begging or resistance, then turned around, leaned against a post, and obediently let Maquis tie them up. The youngest prisoner was only 19 years old, and the oldest was 26 years old. The 2 youngest were tied to the posts at both ends. They were by no means heroes. They had opposed France, and some of them were still firing back on the day of the liberation. But no one denied that they would also face death. They did not kneel, sigh, or avoid the muzzles of the firing squad. Many of the men who were executed did look very young, possibly in their early 20s, and one of them was 19 years old. It was said of this execution on the post that, "I paid a special attention to the 19-year-old boy. He was looking up at the sky, just above the firing squad. However, he would never feel the rain again, nor would he see the beautiful Alps above the town. He stood there until the firing squad suddenly opened fire without any signal. The bullets seemed to have entered the chest and heart of the deceased, but I'm not sure. The shooting was carried out twice. The boy leaned forward and fell back against a pillar, never to look up at the sky again." The firing squad was stood not very far away from their targets, the 6 Milice men, and they raised their rifles up, and without order, took a deadly shot. They were, as mentioned, actually ordered to shoot twice into the Milice men, to ensure that death was most probably confirmed. It was then said by the witness that, At that moment, the 5 bodies to the north of me fell down slowly in a terrifyingly neat pattern. The other boy was still standing there. He seemed to be tied tightly to the pillar. His back was straight, but his head was nodding towards the executioner in front of him. The men had all been shot by 2 bullets, but there was one more to come. An officer would approach the bodies to offer a final coup de grace gunshot to the head. It was said of this finishing blow that the moment after the execution seemed to be frozen in time. Then Maquis officers strode to the execution post and shot each prisoner in the head with a pistol. At that time the boy closest to me almost fell to the ground, his hands, which were not untied, hanging onto the post without touching the ground. The next 4 fell under the post. The boy farthest away also began to slide down slowly. A minute after the officer's inspection, the prisoner's body became cold, and his hands were finally untied from the post. People lifted 6 flat coffins from the truck, which looked like they were made from pine wood. After this, they were packed inside of the coffins, which were then taken through the streets, and the French people rushed towards them, screaming abuse at the remains of the 6 men who had just been executed. The executions of the members of the Milice that took place that day in Grenoble captured the feeling amongst the French population against those men who had helped the German forces. They were incredibly angry against those who had betrayed their nation, deeming them as traitors, and these executions were just 6 of many that were carried out during the Second World War and after, dealing with members of the Milice and those who had sold out their nation to collaborate with the Nazis. Following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the German army rampaged through the Soviet lands, and Kharkiv or Kharkov would become a focus of many major battles. The city was captured by the Nazis and placed under occupation on the 24th of October 1941, and a Red Army offensive failed to recapture the city in May 1942. It would be retaken in February 1943, but a month later would fall again to the Germans. This put the city and the people of it under a significant amount of danger and stress, and before the occupation there were a huge amount of refugees who remained in the city. But the Jewish population would be slaughtered by the German army. They and the Einsatzgruppen, the SS death squads, would carry out a huge amount of slaughter in and around the city, and they would between December 1941 and January 1942 massacre and then bury around 15,000 Jews in a ravine outside of a nearby town. These had been taken from Kharkov, but also around 30,000 residents were executed by the Germans as they were suspected of being Soviet partisans, and 80,000 people also died from hunger, disease and the cold. Further horror occurred as 60,000 people were forcibly transported to Germany to work as slave labourers, but others were also sent to concentration camps. By the time the city was liberated, the population had been reduced to under 200,000, and 70% of the city had been destroyed. It was said in one article that the city was more battered than perhaps any other Soviet city, except Stalingrad. But all around the lands, the Germans would commit a significant amount of slaughter and execution. But when the city was liberated for the last time, the officials inside would then try to punish war criminals who had conducted horror in Kharkov. Further atrocities were committed by the Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen, including hangings and the use of gas vans. The Gestapo would round up and shoot 435 patients who were being treated inside of a local hospital, and many of these were elderly people and children. In March 1943, there were 800 Red Army soldiers who were also shot, and many others were burned alive. The Soviets would state that in the Kharkov region, the German fascist invaders had shot, hanged, burned alive, and poisoned by carbon monoxide gas more than 30,000 peaceful, completely innocent citizens, including women, old people and children. But the Soviets would uncover the mass graves of the victims. There were virtually no Jews who had survived the German occupations. But then a trial was summoned in December 1943. This was known as the Kharkov trial. The point of this was to bring 4 war criminals to justice, and these were men who had been linked to implementing the policies of the Germans, which resulted in such horror and bloodshed. There were 4 defendants who had been captured and brought forward, despite hundreds committing crimes in the city. These defendants were 3 Germans, Wilhelm Langheld, who was 52 years old, Reinhard Retzlaff, who was 36, Hans Ritz, a 24-year-old man, and one Soviet collaborator, Mikhail Bulanov, who was 26. The Germans were members of the Wehrmacht, the police and SS forces, and Bulanov was a man who was accused of treason against his homeland. All of the men were charged under Soviet and international law, and Langheld, Retzlaff and Ritz were accused of participating in the murder and slaughter of Soviet soldiers. The officials presiding over the court were military men, and a 6-person forensic team provided witness and expert testimony in which they documented the shootings and also the use of gas. They would tell the courtroom of the suffering of the victims. It was claimed that these men, the defendants, were Teutonic Knights of the Great Eastern Expanse, who daily and hourly carried out Hitler's orders without feeling good feelings and pity, destroyed civilians who were proud of their cruelty, considering these subhuman worthy of only mass destruction. Their actions led to many thousands of residents mercilessly having violated their rights to live and their rights to defence. They would claim that everyday killings and executions entered the flesh and blood of the executioners, including the Gestapo, and that the defendants were absolutely alien to the idea of good, and they had no organ for its perception. The defence of the 4 men said that they had been just following orders, and this was acknowledged, but was rejected as a sufficient defence, and because of this the 4 men were found guilty of their crimes and were then sentenced to death. The court found that Wilhelm Langheld had been personally involved in a number of cases in which 100 innocent Soviet prisoners of war and civilians were shot and then executed. Hans Ritz had directed the shootings which were carried out by the SD Einsatzgruppe in Tagarog, and it was found that he beat prisoners with rods and truncheons and tortured them for information and false statements. Reinhard Retzlaff was found guilty of torturing Soviet civilians and trying to get false statements from them. It was said he ripped out their hair and tortured them with needles and would order the executions of dozens of civilians. It was said he also drove prisoners into a murder van, and these citizens were then gassed, with Retzlaff then overseeing the burning of their bodies after. Mikhail Bulanov, the Soviet, was found guilty of betraying the Soviet motherland, and he voluntarily sided with the Germans and worked for them as a chauffeur for the Kharkov Gestapo branch. He took part in the executions of civilians using gas vans, and also drove civilians to their executions where they were then shot. When the evidence and verdicts were announced to the courtroom, the room turned to stone as these men were found guilty of being machines of mass murder, and in particular the treason of Bulanov hurt the Soviets. This was a man of the city who was a cog in the machine of mass murder of these people. But the routine killing of people shocked everyone. The men did all plead guilty and they admitted their crimes and described them in detail, but the Soviets would not wait to carry out the executions of the men found guilty at the Kharkov trial. The very next day the 4 men were taken out into the public square of Kharkov for their execution. It was the 19th of December 1943, and at the time in the war vicious fighting would still be erupting, but in Kharkov there were 50,000 people who came to see the executions of the German soldiers. There were 4 gallows which had been made in the town, and each of the men were brought out into the square for their execution. They were accompanied by a number of guards and officials. Thousands of people were gathered around, and they saw the men hanged. It was said of the executions, it was all over in a few moments. The defendants were hoisted into the back of 4 open trucks and stood on stools. Then the nooses were looped around their necks. There was no blindfolding. During the preliminaries, 3 of the 4 prisoners had to be propped up. Bulanov had fainted. Ritz and Retzlaff had turned pasty white. They drawled at their mouths and their knees gave way. Only Langheld, the old soldier, remained stiff as a ramrod throughout, never once flinching. Once the nooses had been adjusted, at a signal the trucks pulled away, and the 4 were left dangling and kicking in midair. For the people of Kharkov, the executions of the men who had worked for the SS, the German army and the Gestapo, was some form of revenge and reprisal for the suffering of the people inside the city. It was a city which suffered greatly, and for many people these were the most evil war criminals. But there were many more who committed crimes during Operation Barbarossa who were never brought to justice. The Arrow Cross Party was led by Ferenc Szalasi, and they were a far-right, ultra-nationalist Hungarian party, and they were in power from the 15th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. Szalasi was made leader whilst he was locked up in prison, and the party had similar views to the Nazis and fascists in Italy. They received around 30 seats in Parliament in the 1939 national elections, but then during World War II were banned much of the time. But when the end of the conflict came, they rose to power. The regent of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, tried to negotiate peace with the Allies, but the Germans kidnapped his son and forced him to abdicate and appoint Ferenc Szalasi as the leader of the nation of Hungary. At the time in which the Arrow Cross came into power, the Soviet Red Army were already inside of Hungary. But Szalasi's government did not have too much authority, and this focused specifically more in the area around Budapest. The rule of the Arrow Cross was short but brutal, and the execution squads of them slaughtered 38,000 Hungarian Jews, and they worked with Adolf Eichmann to resume deportations to concentration camps, and 80,000 people were sent to the death camps. But the Red Army arrived at the edge of Budapest in December 1944, and a siege then took place, but Arrow Cross members then began to execute many people inside the city, including patients within Jewish hospitals, and many women and children inside of the Jewish poorhouses were slaughtered. They continued to slaughter, and many members of the government tried to flee to save their own lives. Ferenc Szalasi, the leader of the nation of Hungary, was one of those who escaped from Budapest on the 11th of December 1944, and he took with him the royal crown of Hungary, and he managed to get through to Germany. Szalasi was the Prime Minister as well, and he was the one who was the head of the government. He went to Germany thinking that Hitler would give him some form of protection and security. However, he travelled to Vienna and then on to Munich, but the cabinet of the Arrow Cross Party was dissolved on the 7th of May 1945, a day before Germany surrendered, and Szalasi was captured by the American army. He was sent back to Hungary and was brought to stand trial in front of the People's Tribunal, the very courts that he had used to execute many of his enemies. Alongside him, brought to court were some other senior members of the Arrow Cross, who too would find themselves executed alongside Ferenc Szalasi within Budapest. Gábor Vajna was a Hungarian Minister of the Interior, and he met with Heinrich Himmler and other senior SS officials, including Adolf Eichmann during the war, and dealt with the deportations of thousands of people to the concentration camps. He was summoned and encouraged to meet with SS officials by Szalasi, and he was a pivotal cog in the destruction of so many people under the Arrow Cross. When Budapest fell, Vajna also tried to escape to Western Europe, but he was also captured by the American army, and was then tried in Budapest with Szalasi, and he was accused of treason, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Károly Berejfi was a very experienced soldier who fought during the First World War and the Second World War, and he would be given command of the Third and First Army. But he experienced a crushing defeat at the hands of the Red Army, and with this he was ousted from power in the military. But Szalasi brought him in from the cold, and he relied on Berejfi with regards to military matters, and Berejfi was then made the Minister of Defence. He was sympathetic to the Arrow Cross cause, but living under German occupation, he had little to no power whatsoever. He was captured also by the Americans, as he had also gone on the run. The fourth and lesser-known official inside of the Arrow Cross who was tried was Joseph Gira. He was a former children's doctor, and he was involved in organising rallies and different meetings within the Arrow Cross, and he was also a member of the Regent Council. He was also brought in front of the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and all four of the men had little excuse for their crimes. They were seen as traitors, men who had willingly sold civilians and Hungarian people, their own, to the enemy, who had then had them slaughtered inside death factories within minutes of them arriving. But all four men were sentenced to death for their actions, and their executions were conducted in a rather swift manner. The method of execution for the members of the Arrow Cross Party was pole hanging. This was known also as the Austrian gallows, or the strangling gallows, and it had a number of different steps with it. It was not as straightforward as using the gallows. Firstly, the condemned was forced to stand before their execution pole or post, and this was usually around 3 meters tall. A rope was then attached around the feet of the condemned, and this was pushed through a pulley at the bottom of the pole. Then the condemned was hoisted in mid-air on the pole by a chest sling, and this was secured under the armpits, suspending them. Then the noose was looped around the neck of the prisoner and was secured to the hook found at the top of the pole. The executioner worked with an assistant, and then he would be stood on the back of the platform on a ledge. He gave the sign to release the chest sling, and with this the condemned then jerked downwards a short distance, and the executioner guided their drop by the foot rope, but the executioner then tried his best to manually dislocate the neck of the condemned. He did this by forcing their head to one side, and he placed the heel of his hand beneath the jaw of the condemned to do this, and increase the force. Some executioners claimed that this was a quick method of execution, and that someone, when performed correctly, could be dead within just a minute. The executions of the Arrow Cross Party members, Ferenc Szalacsi, Joseph Gira, Karoly Beregfi, and Gabor Vajna, took place on the 12th of March 1946. One by one the men were brought out in front of the Budapest Academy of Music, and they were led out by many policemen. They were taken up to the execution post, and handed over to the executioners, who began the preparation for the pole hanging. They passed the ropes through the pulleys for the men, and then secured the nooses. But the men were not condemned simultaneously, they were executed one after the other, and they were not allowed to witness the other ones being executed. All 4 of the men were executed on the execution pole or post, and then following the drop being released, the executioner then placed a white cap over their heads, so the huge crowds of thousands did not see their final gasps of air and moments. The men were then left on the execution post for some time before they were cut down. The crowd that day in Budapest was so large that people were hanging out of windows to catch a glimpse of the executions. But to them the 4 executed men were horrific traitors who had sold their nation over to the enemy for a matter of months. Let's remember that the Hungarians were part of the Axis alliance for a large part of the war, but the collaborationist Arrow Cross Party were ruthless in executing their enemies, and for this the leaders were all executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.